You're watching. You're watching or listening to Strangers in Space, and for the next half an hour or so, we're going to be doing some more Doctor Who what-iffery, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
Hi, I'm Matt.
Hi, I'm John.
Hi, I'm Mark.
So this one was kind of just prompted by being another Nexus point that was an obvious Nexus point. And for the sake of anybody who doesn't know, what we're going to do is go back in time to a particular point in Doctor Who where something happened that changed kind of in a slightly fundamental way the way the series works after one fashion or another, and talk about if things had gone differently. So I'm taking us back to 1996 basically, and the TV movie. But around that, I'm going to ask a series of questions for us this time about sort of related, but not necessarily terrifically related things. And we can talk about whether we think Jeff Goldblum would have made a great Doctor Who or not during the course of this conversation. I guess it's bound to come up, so I've just thrown it in there right at the start. But Dylan, who does this podcast, who's not here for this one, asks. So I'm going to ask all three questions now, and then I'm going to do them one after another in a minute, but I'll let you know what they all are so you can think about it. Dylan asks, what if the TV movie had been a successful backdoor pilot? In other words, what would have happened if Doctor Who had begun to run in Britain and America in the late 90s and presumably carried on thereafter for several more years, such that we wouldn't have had Russell T Davies? Or would we? That's what we'll talk about. My question that I was going to ask, and I'll come back to this, is more about, could there have been an American version that ran concurrently with the British version, a bit like, say, The Office, something like that? What if the Americans had tried their own out? And I'm going to ask, would that affect the British one? Would it make it more popular if the British viewing public knew there was a version happening in America? But given that I was going to ask that anyway, then we got a question from a listener, and this is from Tom on, and I'm not going to call it X. In fact, I don't think it's called X. We're all calling it X, right? The old Twitter. We're all calling it X because it appears to be an X. But I don't think it's an X. Given the sort of manner and the sort of emotional state of most of the people who are on there, I think it's actually Cross. So I think we should call it Cross. So anyway, Tom, Toku BL Hoovian on Twitter, asks, and this is the question the way he phrases it, what if Doctor Who was American? So I want to start there because there's several ways you can read that. I suppose one of them is, what if Doctor Who had started off as an American programme? I'm not entirely sure it would have, but let's just spend a couple of minutes. Can we imagine Doctor Who having started in the 1960s on the other side of the Atlantic? Could they, as a culture, have come up with a programme like this? Because, okay, given the fact that I've asked it, I have a sort of an answer already, and my answer is this. What we do as Brits is we diminish things. And when I say diminish, I don't mean make worse, but what I mean is we diminish things to their sort of smallest constituent parts because we don't have the budget not to. So Doctor Who is about a man and his granddaughter travelling around in a box who get a couple of companions, and it's 4 people. In America, when they tried something similar, it was a battleship in space populated by lots of red shirts and an entire hierarchical sort of military team structure led by Captain Kirk. So for me, I don't think the Americans would have come up with this, not in the 60s.
See, I disagree. I think Star Trek and Doctor Who aren't necessarily as kind of polar opposite analog things as we maybe sometimes like to think. They both have a message of kind of,
Oh yeah,
utopian ideals and everybody working together, and that's all fine. I do think that if Doctor Who had started in America, it probably wouldn't have started until 66, because that seems to be when a lot of these kind of sci-fi shows in the States start. So Star Trek starts towards the end of 66. The Time Tunnel starts towards the end of 1966 as well.
Lost in Space and
and I think you would have something probably more like the Time Tunnel, I would imagine, because that is essentially Doctor Who in American. So I don't think it would necessarily be like Star Trek. It would be more like there's a kind of wacky American professor that's come up with some kind of means of traveling through time. It would be much less education. There would be no educational bent to it. It would be purely about entertainment, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But it's not it's not the Doctor Who that we would have had in the 60s.
Oh no.
And there's an industrial difference between American television and British television as well.
Totally.
So it's not just educational, it's British television having started basically having connections with the stage, Britain having a radio culture in the 1960s that America had effectively lost by then, British actors being different. So there's a kind of so yes, America I think could have made Doctor Who, but it wouldn't have been the same. It wouldn't just have been in an American accent. It would have been grindingly kind of monolithic. It would have been very, 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 very consistent, I would imagine, but it would just be them churning it out like a factory, which the BBC kind of did, but it's the
cottage
BBC
industry style, right?
Yeah, it's the BBC, so it's sort of
25-30 episodes a year.
Yeah, but I think you would get. It would be interesting because I think you would get stuff where it would basically be time travel to wherever they already probably had standing sets. So obviously, like with Star Trek, you get all those kind of, oh, it's the cowboy planet, it's the mafia planet, it's the thing, because
the
it's
desert.
all there on the sort of Paramount lot. So I think you could maybe see some quite interesting things. Whereas obviously, what I think an American Doctor Who would be in the 60s is it would be Doctor Who without the overreach and ambition, and therefore not as endearing and not as kind of long lasting.
Yeah, I also think the way Doctor Who started with that particular sort of that kind of committee, but then it kind of got processed through somebody's very creative brain. I think in America it would have stopped at the committee, and it would have been either a time travel show or it would have been a science fiction space show. I don't think America would have done time travel, space travel all together. It wouldn't have been led by the individual. It's not a character led thing. It would have been a concept led thing, and that means a singular concept.
I think it would have been close to something like the Twilight Zone or the Outer Limits. Those would be my kind of reference points because they're around the time of Doctor Who already. So it's more than likely they'd be kind of maybe treating it as kind of anthology series like that. I think Mark's absolutely right on something like the Time Tunnel as well. It's it's that story of the week thing.
It could be that the TARDIS, instead of being a machine that takes you to a place, is just a window so that you can look at a place. And every episode starts with this character, the Doctor, and his three friends watching the television. And he says, well, let's find out what somebody's up to in Minnesota in 1952.
Yeah.
And then you get a 25-minute Twilight Zone. And then it comes back to the Doctor in the end. And he turns around and says, well, what did we learn about them?
Absolutely.
I think the other thing worth pointing out as well is kind of what Matt was saying about sort of Doctor Who being designed by committee. Nobody would ever, including Sidney Newman, would ever call Doctor Who Sidney Newman's Doctor Who. You've got Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek. You've got Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone. You've got, and I think American television at that point was very kind of creative led. I think, and it's about Roddenberry kind of working within the kind of network and kind of coming up with ways to kind of get his vision out there. Whereas I think with Doctor Who, it's the guy in charge of drama that comes up with a concept, and then he gets some very talented people to work that concept out into something for TV.
I think
Although
America
Newman did try and get a greatest credit in the 80s, of course.
Yeah, but he's probably, bit short of cash.
I think what we get is the elements that Sidney Newman brings to the show, because obviously he designed because Doctor Who is the commercial kind of impulse filtered through the BBC. And what you're going to get is the Sidney Newman thing without, say, David Whittaker's, what David Whittaker and Verity Lambert bring to it, I think. You're going to get the TARDIS taken away. Obviously, what symbol are you going to use of Americana? That would be the interesting thing, because they don't have that. They never had that same kind of trust in the police that we did, I don't think.
I think so. America television is creative, so there is like a creative voice at the centre. So Gene Roddenberry, Irving Allen, but they still have to get through the studios, and that
Yeah,
means
of course.
that means they come up with an idea, but they have to make damn well sure that the idea is a commercial one that will appeal to advertisers. Whereas Sidney Newman's idea was less commercial than Doctor Who became, because Sidney Newman was a sort of, his was a pure idea of no monsters in it and no sort of big commercial things. He wanted history and
but it is cynically designed for that slot between grandstand and Saturday.
Well, and also,
but it's not designed to sell soap.
Well, no, but then also one of the original plot ideas was Planet of the Giants.
Yeah.
You know, they were holding on to that thing for, you know, a year and a half. And I mean, that's quite Irwin Allen as well, that story.
Yeah.
Obviously with a very British, very dull sort of story about pesticides and sort of government overreach. But you could see definitely, I think you're right. I think the Sidney Newman version isn't necessarily Doctor Who at its most commercial. But I do think if you're pitching Planet of the Giants, he's also aware that every now and again you need like giant insects, you know, to scare the kids.
I mean, it's still going after an audience because the BBC had to justify its work, but it's not going after sponsors or advertising. It's not, you know, American television's always scared of putting anything on screen that might put off a shampoo manufacturer.
Yeah. And that's why I think it'd be a little more parochial, not educational, but you know, that those early historicals, I don't think anything up till the Time Meddler is set in Britain, in British history. I think what you'd have seen is everything set in American history somewhere, because that's what sells in America, and America's so big you don't need to go outside.
Yeah, it'd be the gunfighters every other week. I think that's
I'd go with that. I'm happy.
Right, let's move on, because this was supposed to be the short one at the start to get us, you know, to get us up and running, and it's already taken over 12 minutes. So here's another question, or here's the question again, but from a different angle. Tom's question again, but from a different angle. He says, what if Doctor Who was American? I want to ask, because this is a question that comes up a lot. What if you cast an American actor or a non-British actor, let's say, as the lead character? And the answer I always give is, you know, it's still being made in Britain, it's still being made with British writers, it's still being made with British electricians and set dressers and designers and, you know, a music composer and mostly directors and everything else. It's still a British show. I don't think having an actor who speaks in a different accent in the leading part actually changes the program that much, but I'm willing to give a platform to anybody who wants to argue that it does. So I don't know, do any of you think it might? Are any of you scared of having an American actor as the Doctor?
No,
the only problem I would have in having an American actor as the Doctor, it would be an American who'd moved to the UK in the 60s or 70s, and they tended to be the kind of actors. So if you watch even one of the great films ever made, Night of the Demon, or a lot of these Hammer movies, where it has an American to try and sell it a little bit to the American audience, the American actors are always a lower rate than the British actors, because the British actors are fresh off the RSC stage and they're doing things, and it's that stage tradition for a lot of Doctor Who up to maybe Davison.
American actors didn't make it in America, are you saying?
Well, that's the
are we talking about this?
You get a second-rate American actor rather than a first-rate. You wouldn't get Donald Sutherland, even a Canadian. You'd get maybe an alcoholic American actor.
Are you dissing George Citizen Kane Kalouris here?
I mean, yes, yeah. I've seen too many instances of something British, something really British, Robin Hood or, you know, Sherlock Holmes, kind of being ruined by an American actor playing the central part. Matt Frewer, is he Canadian as well? Just Canadians, basically.
Here's a question.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I always kind of rankle against this kind of British exceptionalism that we always kind of tie into Doctor Who, because like, I think one of the worst. I think all the bad parodies of Doctor Who, it's always like, oh, it's a quirky, weird little British show, and it's all a bit cheap and rubbish. I think actually, if anything, if Doctor Who's to survive, it needs to get new writers and new perspectives. And I think maybe you do need an American actor. I don't know.
Well,
if it's the right actor, I think ultimately, the 60-odd year history of Doctor Who will prove is that as long as you've got the right actor and some good scripts.
Hey, and these days you could probably get an American over here, given sort of Disney's money and Disney's involvement. An American comes over and lives in the UK for 9 months, for 3 years. Why not?
It kind of went downhill when they started casting people from Scotland. That was the big problem. You should just be Doctor Who's for the English. I agree.
What are you saying about Sylvester McCoy?
So
just the day after his birthday too.
I know. How dare you?
That's one side. I agree with Mark, because I think it's absolutely fine to cast an American, and it would have made it much more interesting back in the day. My caveat was a kind of a cute one, based on what happens when you cast Americans in British institutions. You don't get the cream of American actors. You don't get Kevin Spacey. So
we've only had really one key creative voice, haven't we? That's American in Doctor Who, and that's Rachel Talalay.
Well, I mean, if you're going to
say Talalay, sorry, can we just pause to hear John call her Talalay?
Where does her surname end? I'm not sure. I'm never sure.
Oh, but if you're going to say American and mean the Americas, North America, Sidney Newman, of course, hailed from those parts, and that's kind
worked
of
in commercial TV in America.
I mean, Donald Sutherland would have been a fantastic Doctor Who.
Well, he was
throw that out there.
One of those names that was always kind of bandied around during the 90s, wasn't it?
I mean, I've always made the joke that you cast a black, trans, gay woman Doctor, but as soon as you give it an American accent, that is when everybody gets really upset, right? So
I think the response to Jodie Whittaker has proved that that's not necessarily.
No. Do you know what I mean? What I'm saying is there is always a group that will, any one of the other things, there is a group that will come out in support that is probably much larger than the group that actually is against it. But the one point where everybody agrees that you should never do it is the Doctor shouldn't have an American accent. And I just think, what are you talking about, really? When people
survive it.
But now
Moffat's dialogue, for instance, is perfect for those American accents. It's the screwball. It's derived from that East Coast comedy from the US. And if you get someone like I saw this Natasha Lyonne on as a Doctor, I would love that.
Yeah, she'd be great.
So long as she could still make Poker Face whilst she's making Doctor Who.
Right, shall we move on with the next question? I mean, we're obviously staying in the same sort of place. Let's go with Dylan's, because I'll come back to my original one afterwards. Dylan's is basically, what if the TV movie had given rise to a series? I think this is a bit looser. I don't think we can really have very definite ideas about this because of the nature of what did happen afterwards. But imagine it wasn't on the same night as Roseanne. Imagine they'd taken off those first 2 minutes, which was
Roseanne
the big
and the NBA playoffs. It's Michael Jordan as well. It's a hell of a tag team.
But I think the big thing that kills the story is those 2 minutes of info dump at the start. I think if you get rid of the 2 minutes of info dump, you can still have the Sylvester McCoy bit going into Paul McGann, and that becomes the mystery for the audience.
Yeah, definitely.
Why has this man changed his face? How is that possible? Where has he come from? That's a possibility. And so you don't even know he's an alien, and these are the things you find out during the course of it. That could have been a really strong piece of TV in America. Let's suppose that had happened and it had been a really strong piece of TV, and the audiences in America, as well as the British audiences who already knew what it was, wanted to carry on finding out more about this. So you get, let's say, 24 episodes a year for the next 5 years, because let's say these things are done in 5 years and then it may or may not continue afterwards. So that takes us to, let's say, 2002, 2003, by the time the pilot goes to a series and does 5 seasons. So I don't propose to ask what those series would have been like. I'm not going to suggest that it would have been just remakes of the British stories, which is one of the ideas that was thrown around.
With daddy issues.
Which is a non-starter of an idea, really. You couldn't
Well,
just have done.
I think you could have got away
done-
with it then, though. In the 90s,
Yeah.
I think you could absolutely not do it now because everything's so easy to access. But
No,
I,
but
I do think there's a point in the 90s, though, where
No, I
in
think-
America, you
Oh,
could
yeah,
get
yeah.
away with it.
But
And I think the British audience become not actually that interested. If the show, because let's face it, stop a second. Let me just get to the point of what you're saying, because your whole thesis
You
is
didn't hear my point.
no, but I did, because your whole thesis is what if Doctor Who became successful? Doctor Who only becomes successful in America if it has an American audience. So if Doctor Who becomes successful in America, the British audience, I think, ceased to kind of matter. And I think actually you could get away with doing remakes of classic Doctor Who stories or Doctor Who stories that no longer exist in the archives, but with Paul McGann, but at 45 minutes.
Yeah,
because who cares?
That wouldn't be why you'd make them. My point was going to be
But it would be an easy way to have some episodes.
Oh yeah,
start
but it
it that
be...
way, I think, because the big audience has not seen these series, does not know them at all.
Exactly.
But my point is kind of that most of those stories aren't really worth retelling. So you have
because a lot what you do with them.
Yeah.
Well, that's it. So you would do
the new podcasters are getting a little bit active. God, we're going to have to start muting people if they don't toe the line.
All right, Jackie Weaver, pipe down.
Well, but what I mean is, you might have a story about Sasquatch, but it wouldn't be the Abominable Snowmen because that story was pertinent to 1967. And so you would change most of the elements out. I mean,
the Hendersons, come on, in the 90s, you could definitely do the Abominable Snowmen Sasquatch.
But it's not a remake of the Abominable Snowmen by Haseman.
I'm kind of with JR on this, that the Doctor Who stories that exist that are really good, I think they're really good because they're British Doctor Who told over 4 or 5, 6 episodes.
All I'm saying is that that's never stopped anybody remaking anything before.
Oh, and this was my point, was that you'd have a mixture of stuff that's remakes, stuff that's brand new, and stuff that's somewhere in between. But my point was that you wouldn't just do a series of only remakes, which is what...
No, of course not. And I don't think they ever pitched that. I think it was that you would have a mix.
That's what I'm talking about.
They pitched it as part of it.
Yeah.
What I find interesting is less what would the American series have been like, but the American series would have been shown over the 1990s, which in the real world, we've got basically the creators of the 2005 series slowly kind of building up fan reputations, writing fan fiction that's essentially the only Doctor Who that's out there, building up to Big Finish. What would have happened to that world if there'd been an American series? Because that's what would have dented or
BBC Books would have stopped the novels, wouldn't they? If the series had been going in America and on British screens, the novels would have stopped. The novels were there because the series.
No, you would have the Eighth Doctor novels because
I don't think you would.
No, but they brought the license back.
Yeah, they brought the license back, but if the series was happening in America, it was an ongoing series. They would have presumably been novelizing the episodes,
possibly
for a younger audience. So you wouldn't get stories too broad or deep. So the complexity of the Eighth Doctor novels.
No, yeah, you're right. It would be a different novel range, but I think, there was, X-Files novels, Star Trek Next Generation novels. It was a thing. So I think you would definitely have. You wouldn't necessarily have novelizations. You'd have spin-off novels, but maybe you're right. Maybe not as complex as the ones that we did.
And you wouldn't have attracted the likes of Russell T Davies to them. I don't.
Well, that would have all happened beforehand, though.
Yeah, Russell.
It's more just.
Alternatively, the likes of Russell T Davies could have found themselves moving to Hollywood in the 1990s for a 5-year series. Presumably, you'd start with kind of American writers with sort of consultants from Britain, but as you slowly run out of ideas, then maybe the British fan pool can be sort of mined. So it could have, made Paul Cornell's career instead.
Well, let's not forget Queer as Folk did gangbusters on British TV and then got remade in America. So Russell T goes out to America. In this parallel universe, Doctor Who's still being made in the States. Do you honestly think he's not going to knock on the door and try and get
Totally.
in there. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I think you would still have a Russell T Davies Doctor Who, but it'd be a very different one.
Well, here's the question then. Say Doctor Who runs for 5, maybe 6, maybe 7 series in America and sort of ends at some time in the early noughties. How long then is it before the BBC bring it back in Britain? Because by the time you're into the noughties, and this is part of the reason why Doctor Who came back in the first place, the way television is financed and produced and commissioned has changed anyway by the time you're into this new century. So I think the BBC could and probably would still have brought Doctor Who back themselves at some point. Do we see that happening?
I think then they're competing against. So one of the reasons it took so long to come back was the technology needed to get to this right position where Doctor Who didn't look embarrassing on screen. But presumably, if you've had 5 years of American money and then suddenly it comes back into British hands, that's a bigger risk rather than a smaller risk.
And that's also why I'm asking how long, I think.
Yeah.
Well, because I think also there's a rights issue as well. I'd be interested, I'd wonder what it would be like if obviously America have been doing it for 5 years. I don't think it would be a simple case of, all right, you have it back now. So I think
we have to ignore that though, because we don't know, do we? They might have handed the rights back at the end of it.
I doubt they would. It depends how the show would have ended. But let's say, they're still holding the rights. I do think it's probably maybe 2010s by the time Doctor Who comes back on British television. Maybe in time for the 50th.
I don't think the BBC would want Doctor Who to finish. I would say that it would come back in-house nearly straight away, to my mind. Because it's always been their intention that it was an ongoing show, whereas America is obviously built around kind of limited number of years on these things.
But I think the problem with that is in 1989 they wanted it to continue, but they wanted it to continue as an independent production. But it took them 7 years to find somebody who would make it to their specifications. And I think again that sort of rears its head. Say we're talking 2003 or whatever, that becomes a thing. The BBC want to take it back in house, but they've forgotten how to make it. So it could again be another 5 years before they actually get it together.
That way Russell comes on board, because I think if they offered Russell T Davies to come on board and they really wanted Russell T Davies to work for the BBC at that point, they would offer him that.
So you can
it's just a case of what would a Russell T Davies show look like straight off the back of a US show.
You can see a world where Doctor Who 2000, the Doctor Who 2000 pitch, suddenly becomes a bit more of a doable thing. Because if Doctor Who has been successful, and if it's lasted for 5 years on American television, that means it's been successful. It's been like, they wouldn't. So the BBC can see that it's got legs, so they would be keen to make it. Russell T Davies and a few others pitched Doctor Who in 2000 to come back in a very bad pitch, but at least it shows interest. And then suddenly get the ball rolling. What I'd be interested in is Paul McGann, whether Paul McGann's there for the full 5 years, or whether American television. So I presume the American television wouldn't necessarily have regeneration in it beyond McCoy to McGann, and that's the kind of a key part of Doctor Who longevity.
Yeah, because obviously American contracts being what they are, I think he would have probably signed McGann up for 5 years with an option for 2 more. So I don't think you would have necessarily had regeneration in there.
No, so that becomes the open end at which it can come back to Britain with a different actor again. Look, let's move on to the other question then. So my other question is kind of this. Let's say sort of 5 Doctors, really successful all over the world, and the Americans look at it and look at the history of Doctor Who and think, well, hang on, why don't we buy the format and make our own version? So let's suppose that around about 1985, and let's say this happens before the hiatus, so this has an effect on sort of decisions that are being made in the mid-1980s. Let's suppose in 1985, an American version of Doctor Who, running parallel with the British one, debuts to great success in America, let's say. I don't want to look at what that American version necessarily is. Obviously, it's got Jeff Goldblum in, and obviously he regenerates into, you know, like
You
Donald
just did this to
Sutherland.
justify
Clearly.
the artwork for the episode.
Yeah, I've made the artwork first, so I've got to get Jeff Goldblum. He's there to represent an American Doctor, so mate. But you know what I'm saying? 1985, there's a really successful American version of Doctor Who, debuts in America. Might get bought by the British. Here's question one: does it get bought by the British and shown on BBC Two in the sort of 10 p.m. slot or something? But my main question is this: 1985. And we know what happens with Michael Grade looking at the Merca and thinking, I'm getting rid of this crap. 1985, if there's a really successful American version happening in America and it's really going gangbusters in America, does Michael Grade look at that? And instead of saying, right, cancel Doctor Who, okay, let's call it hiatus and it can come back in 18 months. Instead, does he look at Doctor Who in Britain and say, no, let's throw some more money at this and make it the hit it should be?
No, what he
No,
does
have you
is he
read
cancels
those books?
Doctor Who, and he just buys the American Doctor Who.
And
Well,
puts
that's
it on
one answer,
BBC
yeah.
One at prime time.
Yeah, that's what he does, because that's Michael Grade knows a good TV show when he sees one. Doctor Who can't compete with American science fiction. He knows this. He sees, and then he gets given the shining example of why this doesn't work, which is an American version of Doctor Who. Of course, he's going to cancel the show and just buy the American version.
Well, let's extrapolate a bit
You
further.
see that
then.
in his autobiography, because his autobiographical memoir, he says, we don't have the budget to do it. We cannot compete. You know, people want Star Wars, they want the special effects, and we cannot do this anymore. So get rid of it.
So let's extrapolate a bit further. The American one, let's say, runs for 5 years and finishes in 1989, 1990. And it's been very successful, and it's been running very successful on our screens. How long is it before we start making it again or find somebody else to make it again for us?
I think they might try it quite quickly, but a sort of different version, because this is the year that they start doing Bugs and
Right.
Crime Traveller, and they start making things, which is, why aren't you making Doctor Who in this slot things? And they're not big budget, but they're starting. The 90s, early 90s BBC is starting to have a kind of an American feel to it, not a high-end American feel. It's a Knight Rider feel to it, but it's still American. That's my view.
Yeah. No, for most of that decade, actually, you've got, and into the next decade until Doctor Who comes back, you've got surrogates for it, substitutes for it, things like Strange, and things like even the sort of Randall and Hopkirk is sort of going, you know, the one with Vic and Bob is kind of basically going in the Doctor Who slot for the Doctor Who feel, really. That's what they're looking at. That's what those programs are really there about. So, but so let's ask you an opinion. Do you think an American version done like that would have been a terrible thing? Or do you think could it have been a decent thing? I mean,
It
the
would be
Americans
factory TV.
But
very
we look
much.
down our noses at American TV as Doctor Who fans, and we certainly did back then. But the Americans make some amazing television programs.
They did,
and
but American TV it's that thing. Terence Dicks saying, "Don't get the test card on screen." You again, as Mark has said repeatedly, it's about the commercial impulse. American TV is very formulaic up till they suddenly get, they like Stephen Bochco to go with stuff. So
but even at the time we're talking, you're talking the time of the X-Files, you're talking the time of
we're not, because you were talking like 85.
We're talking earlier, the mid 90s, when USTV gets that prestige push.
The mid 80s is the age of Manimal.
Battlestar Galactica,
it's high
1980,
it would have been a high concept show.
But the mid 80s actually is also the age of things like the original V miniseries, which did go to a series just for 1 year, but the actual miniseries itself is big event television, high concept, character driven drama with a sort of big science fiction conceit behind it. And it looks very cheesy compared to kind of things we're used to since, but that is not production line television. That is big, serious. To
But
a
I think
degree.
Doctor
thing
Who
is,
would be
yeah,
production line television. anyway.
Probably, yeah.
It's gonna look like the A-Team, like Knight Rider, like Manimal, like Airwolf, like Street Hawk, that kind of thing.
Oh, now I really want the Doctor Who theme done by Mike Wolf.
Oh,
That would be
Mike Post,
surely.
yeah.
Surely AI could come up with like Mike Wolf.
I'm sure it could. Yeah, for sure. Would an American series, if the Americans had made their version of Doctor Who that was supposed to run parallel with ours, let's say they do make one that does run parallel with ours in this parallel universe, do they have an American actor? Do they have Jeff Goldblum?
Yes.
Do they have Donald Sutherland? Or do they, because they're making this version of a British series, do the Americans actually say, no, we should get a British actor to do it, and they have somebody, somebody akin to Patrick Stewart, because they import Patrick Stewart for Star Trek. Do they import, somebody like Ian McKellen for Doctor
Edward
Who?
Woodward was doing The Equalizer at this point, so
Yeah.
why not?
They'd probably get Dale Midkiff or something.
Or an ex-Carry On actor.
Yeah. Jim Dale, one of the Dales.
Oh, yeah, that's the one I was thinking of.
It's the quirky action hero thing they want, isn't it? It's not someone bland. It's a more obvious hero than the British Doctor. But
I'd be interested to see what that would look like. Would it be a quirky action hero, or would it be a kind of old professorial, American Harvard professor who's cracked time travel and has a sexy team of, young companions, and you kind of go down that route? Which in the 80s, I kind of think maybe, possibly, you kind of do that. I don't know.
It's kind of lost its space potential, sort of that kind of
like Capaldi's last season, almost.
Yes,
that kind of thing.
It's not impossible. Right, shall we call it a day there, or is there? I mean, to do with America and Doctor Who, are there any questions that any of you have kind of?
Only one, which is something like The Office gets syndicated or gets like rolled out to every country in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And if America's making a series of Doctor Who, and this is what I don't understand, this is where we need sort of someone like Dylan. What's the difference between Ricky Gervais's relationship with The Office and the fact that Ricky Gervais can sell it to France, Germany, Scotland, Norway, all these foreign countries, whereas Doctor Who doesn't feel like with what we know about the rights and the tangles.
It hasn't got a single creator.
I think that must be it, because ultimately,
The Office was made after BBC was bringing programs in by independent production companies. So The Office is made by an outside company, and so Ricky Gervais owns the rights, or this company through Ricky Gervais owns the rights.
Also, anyone who you could view as a creator of Doctor Who was employed by the BBC at the time, therefore it belongs to BBC, whereas Gervais wasn't directly employed by the BBC.
Yeah, which presumably is a stumbling block for even an American produced Doctor Who in parallel with the British.
Yeah,
Doctor
absolutely.
Who.
Yeah. And also, I guess, on the one hand, the Doctor Who format is sellable. It's like The Office in a way, in that obviously everybody, has worked in an office, therefore you can do different Office clones all around the world. Doctor Who is essentially a guy with a blue box that can go anywhere in time and space. You could easily, make that international versions of that, but because of the way this show's kind of been set up since 1963, you're never going to get that.
Yeah, it's a stranger coming into town thing, which is a very big thing on American TV. The Incredible Hulk, 70s version, or Quantum Leap, etc.
The Littlest Hobo.
The Littlest Hobo, exactly that.
Fugitive.
There you go.
Gentle Ben. Highway to Heaven.
Flipper.
Right, if we're just sitting here naming American programs, I think we're done. I think this will be an episode in its own right, so there won't be a second half to this, but this will be the American Doctor Who What If program. We'll come back and we'll do other ones instead. In fact, we'll have a question by, if I can find it, David Moss is going to ask a question for our next episode, and that'll be related to a question I had too. So the next time we come back, we'll do that. Until then, I was JR.
I was Matt.
I was John.
And I was Mark.
And we will speak again soon.